Hello, everyone. My name is Julia, and I'm starting my Sunday's reading of The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. In our previous meeting, we did it not on YouTube, but I read it in Discord, and unfortunately, I couldn't save the this session. But I hope today everything will go fine, and I will be able to to save the video so that it stays on my channel. Yeah. I hope today you will enjoy the first chapter of the book because last time I read only the some sort of an introduction to the book, but today it is already the very first chapter, and I'm going to read only for the first half of it. It will take us about, I don't know, 30 minutes. And after I have finished reading, we still can go mm, to the server, to my server in Discord and can discuss everything. So it will be some sort of a speaking club, or as I prefer to name it, a discussion area. Yeah. So, okay, let us start. I'm going to read and I hope everything goes fine. So, thank you for joining me. Yeah, so waiting for any newcomers. Well, part 1. Umberto Eco's anti-library, or how we seek validation. The writer Umberto Eco belongs to that small class of scholars who are encyclopedic, insightful, and non-dull. He is the owner of a large personal library containing 30,000 books, and separates visitors into two categories: those who react with, "Wow, Signor Professor Dr. Eco, what a library you have! How many of these books have you read?" And the others, a very small minority, who get the point that a private library is not an ego-boosting appendage but a research tool. Read books are far less valuable than unread ones. The library should contain as much of what you do not know as your financial means, mortgage rates, and the currently tight real estate market allow you to put there. You will accumulate more knowledge and more books as you grow older, and the growing number of unread books on the shelves will look at you menacingly. Indeed, the more you know, the larger the rows of unread books. Let us call this collection of unread books an anti-library. We tend to treat our knowledge as personal property to be protected and defended. It is an ornament that allows us to rise in the pecking order. So this tendency to offend Echo's library sensibility by focusing on the known is a human bias that extends to our mental operations. People don't walk around with anti resumes telling you what they have not studied or experienced. It's the job of their competitors to do that. But it would be nice if they did. Just as we need to stand library logic on its head, we will work on standing knowledge itself on its head. Note that the black swan comes from our misunderstanding of the likelihood of surprises, those unread books, because we take what we know a little too seriously. Let us call an anti-scholar someone who focuses on the unread books and makes an attempt not to treat his knowledge as a treasure or even a possession or even a self-esteem enhancement device, a skeptical empiricist. The chapter in this section addresses the question of how we humans deal with knowledge and our preference for the anecdotal over the empirical. Chapter 1 presents the black swan as grounded in the story of my own obsession. I will make a central distinction between the two varieties of randomness in Chapter 3. After that, Chapter 4 briefly returns to the black swan problem in its original form, how we tend to generalize from what we see. Then, I present the three facets of the same black swan problem. A. The error of confirmation, or how we are likely to undeservedly score the virgin part of the library. The tendency to look at what confirms our knowledge, not our ignorance. In Chapter 5. B. The narrative fallacy, or how we fool ourselves with stories and anecdotes. Chapter 6. C. How emotions get in the way of our interference. Chapter 7. And D. The problem of silent evidence, or the tricks history uses to hide black swans from us, Chapter 8. Chapter 9 discusses the little fallacy of building knowledge from the world of games. Chapter 1. The apprenticeship of an empirical skeptic. Anatomy of a black swan, the triplet of opacity, reading books backward, the rearview mirror, everything becomes explainable. Always talk to the driver with caution. History doesn't crawl with jobs. It was so unexpected, sleeping for 12 hours. This is not an autobiography, so I will skip the scenes of war. Actually, even if it were an autobiography, I would still skip the scenes of war. I cannot compete with action movies or memoirs of adventurers more accomplished than myself, so I will stick to my specialties of chance and uncertainty. Anatomy of a Black Swan. For more than a millennium, the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, called Syria Libanensis or Mount Lebanon, had been able to accommodate at least a dozen different sects, ethnicities, and beliefs. It worked like magic. The place resembled major cities of the eastern Mediterranean, called the Levant, more than it did the other parts in the interior of the Near East. It was easier to move by ship than by land through the mountainous terrain. The Levantine cities were mercantile in nature. People dealt with one another according to a clear protocol, preserving a peace conducive to commerce. And they socialized quite a bit across communities. This millennium of peace was interrupted only by small occasional friction within Muslim and Christian communities, rarely between Christians and Muslims. While the cities were mercantile and mostly Hellenistic, the mountains had been settled by all manner of religious minorities who claimed to have fled both the Byzantine and Muslim orthodoxies. A mountainous terrain is an ideal refuge from the mainstream, except that your enemy is the other refugee competing for the same type of rugged real estate. The mosaic of cultures and religions there was deemed an example of coexistence. Christians of all varieties, Maronites, Armenians, Greco-Syrian Byzantine Orthodox, even Byzantine Catholic, in addition to the few Roman Catholics left over from the Crusades, Muslims, uh, Shiite and Sunni, Druzes, and a few Jews. It was taken for granted that people learned to be tolerant there. I recall how we were taught in school how far more civilized and wiser we were than those in the Balkan communities, where not only did the locals refrain from bathing, but also fell prey to fractious fighting. Things appeared to be in a state of a stable equilibrium, evolving out of a historical tendency for betterment and tolerance. Terms balance and equilibrium were often used. Both sides of my family came from the Greco-Syrian community, the last Byzantine outpost of northern Syria, which included what is now called Lebanon. Note that the Byzantines called themselves Romans, Romi, plural Rome, in the local languages. We originate from the olive-growing area at the base of Mount Lebanon. We chased the Maronite Christians into the mountains in the famous Battle of Emyon, my ancestral village. Since the Arab invasion in the 7th century, we had been living in mercantile peace with the Muslims, with only some occasional harassment by the Lebanese Maronite Christians from the mountains. By some literally Byzantine arrangement between the Arab rulers and the Byzantine emperors, we managed to pay taxes to both sides and get protection from both. We thus managed to live in peace for more than a millennium, almost devoid of bloodshed. Our last true problem was the later troublemaking Crusaders, not the Muslim Arabs. The Arabs, who seemed interested only in warfare and poetry, and later the Ottoman Turks, who seemed only concerned with warfare and pleasure, left us the uninteresting pursuit of commerce and the less dangerous one of scholarships, like the translation of Aramaic and Greek texts. By any standard, the country called Lebanon, to which we found ourselves suddenly incorporated after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, in the early 20th century appeared to be a stable paradise. It was also cut in a way to be predominantly Christian. People were suddenly brainwashed to believe in the nation state as an entity. It is remarkable how fast and how effectively you can construct a nationality with a flag, a few speeches, and a national anthem. To this day, I avoid the label Lebanese, preferring the less restrictive Levantine designation. The Christians convinced themselves that they were at the origin and center of what is loosely called Western culture, yet with a window on the East. In a classical case of static thinking, nobody took into account the differentials in birth rate between communities, and it was assumed that a slight Christian majority would remain permanent. Levantines had been granted Roman citizenships, which allowed St. Paul, a Syrian, to travel freely through the ancient world. People felt connected to everything they felt was worth connecting to. The place was exceedingly open to the world, with a vastly sophisticated style, a prosperous economy, and temperate weather, just like California, with snow-covered mountains jutting above the Mediterranean. It attracted a collection of spies, both Soviet and Western, prostitutes, blondes, writers, poets, drug dealers, adventurers, compulsive gamblers, tennis players, après-skis, and merchants, all professions that complement one another. Many people acted as if they were in an old James Bond movie, or the days when playboys smoked, drank, and instead of going to the gym, cultivated relationships with good tailors. The main attribute of paradise was there. Cab drivers were said to be polite, though from what I remember, they were not polite to me. True, with hindsight, the place may appear more Elysian in the memory of people than it actually was. I was too young to taste the pleasures of the place, as I became a rebellious idealist and, very early on, developed an ascetic taste, averse to the ostentatious signaling of wealth, allergic to Levantine culture's overt pursuit of luxury, and its obsession with things monetary. As a teenager, I could not wait to go settle in metropolis with fewer James Bond types around. Yet, I recall something that felt special in the intellectual air. I attended the French lycée that had one of the highest success rates for the French baccalaureate, the high school degree, even in the subject of the French language. French was spoken there with some purity. As in pre-revolutionary Russia, the Levantine Christian and Jewish patrician class from Istanbul to Alexandria spoke and wrote formal French as a language of distinction. The most privileged was sent to school in France, as both my grandfathers were, my paternal namesake in 1912 and my mother's father in 1929. 2,000 years earlier, by the same instinct of linguistic distinction, the snobbish Levantine patricians wrote in Greek, not the vernacular Aramaic. The New Testament was written in the bad local patrician Greek of our capital, Antioch, prompting Nietzsche to shout that God spoke bad Greek. And after Hellenism's decline, they took up Arabic. So, in addition to being called a paradise, the place was also said to be a miraculous crossroads of what we superficially tagged Eastern and Western cultures. On walking walks. My ethos was shaped when, at 15, I was put in jail for allegedly attacking a policeman with a slab of concrete during a student riot. An incident with strange ramifications since my grandfather was then the Minister of the Interior and the person who signed the order to crush our revolt. One of the rioters was shot dead when a policeman who had been hit on the head with a stone panicked and randomly opened fire on us. I recall being at the center of the riot and feeling a huge satisfaction upon my capture, while my friends were scared of both prison and their parents. We frightened the government so much that we were granted amnesty. There were some obvious benefits in showing one's ability to act on one's opinion and not compromising an inch to avoid offending or bothering others. I was in a state of rage and didn't care what my parents and grandfather thought of me. This made them quite scared of me, so I could not afford to back down or even blink. Had I concealed my participation in the riot, as many friends did, and been discovered, instead of being openly defiant, I am certain that I would have been treated as a black sheep. It is one thing to be cosmetically defiant of authority by wearing unconventional clothes, what social scientists, economists call cheap signaling, and another to prove willingness to translate belief into action. My paternal uncle was not too bothered by my political ideas, these come and go. He was outraged that I used them as an excuse to dress sloppily. To him, inelegance on the part of a close family member was the mortal offense. Public knowledge of my capture had another major benefit. It allowed me to avoid the usual outward signs of teenage rebellion. I discovered that it is much more effective to act like a nice guy and be reasonable if you prove willing to go beyond just verbiage. You can afford to be compassionate, lax, and cautious if, once in a while, when it is least expected of you, but completely justified, you sue someone or savage an enemy just to show that you can walk the walk. Paradise evaporated. The Lebanese paradise suddenly evaporated after a few bullets and mortar shells. A few months after my jail episode, after close to 13 centuries of remarkable ethnic coexistence, a black swan, coming out of nowhere, transformed the place from heaven to hell. A fierce civil war began between Christians and Muslims, including the Palestinian refugees who took the Muslim side. It was brutal, since the zones were in the center of the town, and most of the fighting took place in residential areas. My high school was only a few hundred feet from the war zone. The conflict lasted more than a decade and a half. I will not get too descriptive. It may be that the invention of gunfire and powerful weapons turned what in the age of the sword would have been just tense conditions into a spiral of uncontrollable tit for tat warfare. Aside from the physical destruction, which turned out to be easy to reverse with a few motivated contractors, bribed politicians, and naive bondholders, the war removed much of the crust of sophistication that had made the Levantine cities a continuous center of great intellectual refinement for 3,000 years. Christians have been leaving the area since Ottoman times. Those who moved to the west took Western first names and loaded in. The exodus accelerated. The number of cultured people dropped below some critical level. Suddenly, the place became a vacuum. Brain drain is hard to reverse, and some of the old refinements may be lost forever. The starry night. The next time you experience a blackout, take some solace by looking at the sky. You will not recognize it. Beirut had frequent power shutdowns during the war. Before people bought their own generators, one side of the sky was clear at night, owing to the absence of light pollution. That was the side of town farthest from the combat zone. People deprived of television drove to watch the erupting lights of nighttime battles. They appeared to prefer the risk of being blown up by mortar shells to the boredom of a dull evening. So you could see the stars with great clarity. I had been told in high school that the planets are in something called equilibrium, so we did not have to worry about the stars hitting us unexpectedly. To me, that eerily resembled the stories we were also told about the unique historical stability of Lebanon. The very idea of assumed equilibrium bothered me. I looked at the constellations in the sky and did not know what to believe. History and the triplet of opacity. History is opaque. You see what comes out, not the script that produces events, the generator of history. There is a fundamental incompleteness in your grasp of such events, since you do not see what's inside the box, how the mechanisms work. What I call the generator of historical events is different from the events themselves, much as the minds of the gods cannot be read just by witnessing their deeds. You are very likely to be fooled about their intentions. This disconnect is similar to the difference between the food you see on the table at the restaurant and the process you can observe in the kitchen. The last time I brunched at a certain Chinese restaurant on Canal Street in downtown Manhattan, I saw a rat coming out of the kitchen. The human mind suffers from three ailments as it comes into contact with history, what I call the triplet of opacity. They are A. The illusion of understanding, or how everyone thinks he knows what is going on in a world that is more complicated or random than they realize. B. The retrospective distortion, or how we can assess matters only after the fact, as if they were in a rearview mirror. History seems clearer and more organized in history books than in empirical reality. And C. The overvaluation of factual information and the handicap of authoritative and learned people, particularly when they create categories, when then platonify. So this is the end of today's extract. As I can see, I read it even faster. I thought it would be about 30 minutes, but now it's only 20 with something. And in our next time, mm, the second half of the chapter will be a bit longer, mm, as I truly tried to divide the chapter into two halves, yeah, but it was impossible thanks to due to the uh, sub chapters inside. Yeah, so I hope today's one will be. mm Today's one was okay in timing, but the next one will be also okay, just a bit too longer. And now, if you want um, to join me in some discussion of this extract, you can click the link below in description of this video, and you will enter a server on Discord. Um, so, if I'm not mistaken, it is also called nonfiction in English. Yeah, and you can freely join me to discuss some of the topics that we have been reading about today. So, thank you very much for listening, and till the next time, then.